It is minutes before midnight on June 6th, 1944. 6 heavy British gliders, completely without engines, plummet in dead silence toward the pitch-black French countryside. Their targets are 2 small, seemingly insignificant bridges crossing the Caen Canal and the Orne River. The margin for error is terrifying. Missing the landing zone by just a few dozen meters means plunging into the deep water, crushing the wooden aircraft against the tree line, or giving the German guards enough time to press the detonation buttons. Inside the fragile fuselages, 181 men brace for impact as the dark ground rushes up to meet them. When we envision the Normandy invasion, the mind immediately jumps to the colossal, fortified concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall and armadas stretching across the horizon. But the fate of the entire eastern flank did not hinge on a massive fortress. It rested entirely on these 2 unassuming, narrow crossings. They were the ultimate bottleneck. If the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River remained in German hands or were blown to pieces, the British airborne divisions dropping further inland would be trapped and systematically annihilated. More importantly, these spans offered the fastest, most direct route for German panzer divisions to drive their heavy armour straight into the vulnerable Allied landing beaches. Forcing the German tanks to circumvent this route would cost them precious hours, time they simply did not have, and time the Allies desperately needed to establish a foothold in the sand. Securing this specific choke point was the absolute prerequisite to preventing a catastrophic armoured counterattack that could have crushed the invasion in its opening hours. How did a vanguard of exactly 181 lightly armed men drop out of the night sky, instantly overwhelm a fortified garrison, and alter the trajectory of the most famous day in military history before the sun even rose? Pitting a small airborne force against the looming threat of German armour was a monumental gamble. Executing a mission this desperate would demand far more than just raw courage. It would require an obsessive, unprecedented level of preparation. The answer to that monumental gamble rested on the shoulders of one man, and the unit he had relentlessly forged. Major John Howard was not your typical aristocratic British officer. A former police officer who had worked his way up through the ranks, Howard possessed a ruthless practicality, a disciplined mind, and an obsessive eye for detail. He commanded D Company of the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, often simply referred to as the Ox and Bucks. When Howard was handed the objective of securing the bridges, he understood immediately that standard infantry tactics would result in a massacre. The margin for error wasn't going to be measured in hours, but in seconds and feet. To pull this mission off, D Company couldn't just be highly trained. They had to operate like a single, autonomous, unthinking machine. And so began 18 months of the most grueling, psychologically taxing preparation in the history of the British Army. Howard's first directive was to remove all abstraction from the training. In the fields of the English countryside near Exeter, the military constructed exact, full-scale replicas of both the Caen Canal and Orne River bridges. Using canvas, white tape, stakes and scaffolding, they traced the precise dimensions of the steel structures, the approaches, the trenches, and the concrete pillboxes. The layout was constantly updated based on classified aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by low-flying Spitfires and intelligence smuggled out by the French resistance. Howard made his men live and breathe within these dimensions. He gathered them around detailed sand table models and relentlessly quizzed them, demanding to know the exact distance from a specific tree to the German machine gun nest. If a man hesitated, he was replaced. They assaulted the mock bridges in broad daylight until they knew the exact number of paces required to cross the open ground. Then they did it at dusk. Finally, they executed the drills in pitch blackness. Howard was so uncompromising about his men losing their bearings in the dark that he forced them to wear dark-tinted goggles during daytime exercises. This removed their reliance on sight, forcing them to navigate the approach paths by touch, sound, and sheer muscle memory. They practiced over and over until a soldier could close his eyes, sprint forward, and point exactly to where the enemy sentry would be standing. But flawless muscle memory in a sterile environment was not enough. Major Howard knew that no plan survives contact with the enemy, especially when the chosen delivery method was essentially a controlled plane crash. He had to simulate the massive adrenaline dump, the sudden disorientation, and the extreme physical shock of battle fatigue. He would routinely wake his men in the dead of night, force them into heavy combat gear, and march them at a punishing pace for miles across rugged terrain. When they were on the brink of physical collapse, with lungs burning and legs shaking, he would fire a flare into the sky. That was the signal. Without pausing to catch their breath, the exhausted men had to immediately transition into a full-speed, hyper-aggressive assault on the mock bridges. Howard was artificially inducing the extreme physical limits they would inevitably face in Normandy. Furthermore, he instituted a strict policy of cross-training. In a chaotic night drop, the chain of command could evaporate in an instant. If a platoon commander went down, the sergeant had to immediately take over. If the sergeant was killed, a corporal stepped up. If every non-commissioned officer was wiped out, the lowest-ranking private was expected to perfectly understand the overarching objective and how to command the surviving men. A rifleman had to know how to prime specialized explosives, operate a captured German machine gun, and administer emergency medical aid. There could be no hesitation, no waiting for orders in the dark, and no paralyzing confusion. This level of fanatical preparation was entirely demanded by the brutal operational parameters of their delivery system. D Company was not jumping from perfectly functioning transport planes with standard parachutes. They were going to war inside airspeed Horsa gliders. These were massive, unpowered aircraft constructed almost entirely of plywood and tightly stretched fabric. They were literally flying wooden boxes. Towed high across the English Channel by heavy bombers, they would be released to silently glide down into hostile territory. The plan required the elite pilots of the Glider Pilot Regiment to steer these fragile wooden beasts through the night sky without radar and deliberately crash them into a tiny field surrounded by tall trees, a canal, and a flooded pond. It was a controlled collision at 90 miles per hour. If the pilots came in too high, the gliders would overshoot and crash directly into the fortified German defences. If they came in too low, they would smash apart in the tree line or plunge into the deep water, drowning the men trapped inside. And surviving that horrific impact was only the starting line. Once the heavy gliders slammed into the Normandy dirt and tore themselves apart, a terrifying countdown began. Howard calculated that his men had less than 2 minutes from the moment the violent motion stopped to secure the primary objective. 120 seconds. In that impossibly tight window, concussed, battered men had to instantly unbuckle their harnesses, smash their way through the splintered wooden fuselage if the doors were jammed, orient themselves in the dark, sprint across unknown terrain, overwhelm a fully armed garrison, and locate and sever the physical wires leading to the demolition charges. They had to achieve all of this completely isolated from the rest of the Allied invasion force. D Company would have no heavy artillery support to soften the concrete bunkers. They would have no tanks to absorb incoming fire. Their available arsenal was limited strictly to what they could carry in their hands. Sten submachine guns, Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, hand grenades, and a handful of unproven Piat anti-tank spring launchers. They were relying entirely on total surprise, explosive speed, and 18 months of agonizing repetition against an enemy equipped with anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, and the constant threat of a single button press that could blow the bridge to pieces. Every single variable had been calculated. Every worst-case scenario had been relentlessly rehearsed until it became instinct. But as the men sat shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating darkness of the wooden gliders, listening to the furious wind howling against the thin plywood fuselage, the comforting realm of theory vanished. The heavy tow ropes were about to detach, and the terrifying, violent reality of the drop was rushing up to meet them. At 16 minutes past midnight, the heavy tow ropes snapped away. The roaring engines of the Halifax bombers faded into the distance, leaving the wooden Horsa gliders to drop into a sudden, terrifying silence. Down below, the dark shape of the Caen Canal emerged from the shadows. The pilot of glider number 1 forced the nose down, hauling back on the controls at the very last second. The aircraft slammed into the French dirt at 90 miles an hour. It bounced, tore through barbed wire, and ploughed a deep, violent trench across the field. Sparks showered as the landing gear sheared off, the fuselage groaning and splintering under the immense friction. When the wreckage finally shuddered to a halt, the nose of the glider was buried in the embankment. They had stopped exactly 47 metres from the steel girders of the bridge. It was an astonishing feat of aviation, but the noise of the crash was deafening. On the bridge, a German sentry turned toward the sudden, thunderous sound of tearing wood and scraping metal. The element of total surprise should have vanished right then. Protocol dictated he immediately raise the alarm, alerting the machine gun nests and the engineers standing by the demolition plungers. But in the dark, the sentry made a fatal miscalculation. Allied aircraft had been crossing the coast for hours. Hearing the violent crunch of wood and canvas in the adjacent field, he assumed he was listening to a downed bomber. He hesitated. He did not shout. He did not sprint for the detonator. He simply peered into the gloom, trying to visually confirm the wreckage. That single fleeting assumption gifted the British the most valuable currency in modern warfare: seconds. Inside the shattered remains of glider number 1, the stunned men didn't wait for orders. The 18 months of agonizing, repetitive conditioning took over instantly. Before the dust of the crash had even begun to settle, airborne troops were kicking their way through the splintered fuselage. They flooded out into the night air, weapons raised, moving with a terrifying synchronized speed. There was no shouting, no confusion. Every man knew exactly how many paces to take. As they materialized from the darkness and sprinted up the embankment, the German defenders finally realized this was not a downed bomber. The silence of the night shattered. Flares shot into the sky, casting a stark, blinding light over the canal, and the heavy chatter of machine guns began to tear across the approach path. Leading the desperate sprint onto the bridge was 28-year-old Lieutenant Den Brotheridge. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't slow down to assess the firing lanes. Driven by the absolute necessity to reach the far side before the explosives could be triggered, Brotheridge charged directly onto the steel span, firing his submachine gun from the hip. He lobbed a grenade into the closest pillbox, silencing its weapon. But as he crossed the halfway point, a burst of enemy fire cut through the night. Brotheridge fell to the steel deck. In that violent exchange, he became the very first Allied soldier to be killed in action on D-Day. His sacrifice, however, kept the momentum unbroken. His platoon surged past him, overwhelming the remaining sentries in a wave of suppressed fury. Engineers frantically sprinted down to the concrete pylons, their hands searching in the dark for the physical links to the explosives. They found the thick demolition wires and instantly severed them. The circuit was broken. Simultaneously, just a few hundred yards away, the second wave of gliders crashed near the Orne River. Those troops executed the exact same ruthless choreography, overwhelming the river crossing with identical precision. The sheer speed of the assault had completely paralysed the German chain of command. In just 10 frantic, explosive minutes, a small vanguard of lightly armed infantry had dropped out of the night sky, crashed into the mud, and seized 2 of the most heavily fortified choke points in Normandy without triggering a single demolition charge. The impossible raid had succeeded flawlessly. But as the adrenaline began to clear and the distant rumble of German armour started echoing through the dark countryside, the brutal reality of their situation set in. They had violently taken the bridges. Now, completely cut off and vastly outnumbered, exactly how were they supposed to hold them? The adrenaline of the 10-minute assault began to ebb, rapidly replaced by the freezing reality of the Normandy night and the agonizing weight of their isolation. Major John Howard's men had secured the asphalt and the steel, but static defence was fundamentally against the nature of airborne infantry. They were a highly specialised shock force, designed to strike with sudden violence, not to hold ground in a war of attrition against heavy mechanised formations. Yet, holding this exact patch of ground was precisely what the overarching operational timetable demanded. Howard immediately ordered his platoons to fan out, establishing a tight, interlocking defensive perimeter at both ends of the captured bridges. The men dragged the bodies of the German sentries into the shadows, hastily repurposed the captured MG-34 machine gun nests, and began desperately digging their own trenches into the hard, unforgiving earth. Every man gripping an entrenching tool knew the brutal mathematics of their situation. There were exactly 181 of them. They were completely cut off, operating miles behind the enemy coast, with the English Channel at their backs and the entirety of the German 7th Army waking up in the dark in front of them. The element of surprise, their single greatest weapon, was now entirely spent. From this moment forward, their survival depended exclusively on what they had managed to carry across the Channel in their own hands. Look closely at that available arsenal, and the sheer audacity of the mission comes into terrifying focus. An airborne soldier drops into combat with an inherently light footprint, governed by the strict weight capacities of wooden gliders. Howard's men had no heavy anti-tank guns. They had no artillery pieces to call upon, no heavy mortar teams to disrupt enemy formations, and absolutely no armoured vehicles to anchor their fragile defensive line. They were armed primarily with Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles, a design dating back to the late 19th century, and Sten submachine guns. The Sten was a weapon of brutal economic necessity, stamped out of cheap metal, prone to jamming if even a small amount of dirt entered its open bolt, and effective only at extremely close ranges. For sustained, suppressive firepower, the paratroopers relied entirely on the Bren light machine gun. The Bren was an exceptional, highly accurate weapon, but it was fed by a top-mounted 30-round magazine that required constant, frantic reloading during a heavy firefight. This was an arsenal meticulously built for rapid trench clearing and close-quarters raiding, not for repelling a determined, mechanised counteroffensive. But the most terrifying deficiency in their inventory was their anti-tank capability. The bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River were the primary arteries for the local German panzer divisions. Armour was coming. That was not a probability, it was an absolute tactical certainty. To stop 30 tons of advancing German steel, the British airborne relied on a single, highly unconventional and notoriously temperamental piece of equipment: the PIAT, or Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It is crucial to understand exactly what this weapon was, because the fate of the eastern flank of D-Day would soon rest entirely upon its crude mechanics. Unlike the American bazooka or the German Panzerschreck, which utilised rocket propulsion to smoothly launch a warhead, the PIAT was essentially a massive shoulder-fired spring. It was a heavy, awkward steel tube containing a colossal coil. To cock the weapon, a soldier had to lie on his back, place his feet squarely on the shoulder pad, grip the trigger guard with both hands, and heave upward with immense physical force to compress the 200-pound spring until it locked into place. In the middle of a firefight, standing up or rolling over to perform this exhausting physical movement was practically a death sentence. When the trigger of the PIAT was pulled, the massive spring violently drove a heavy steel spigot forward into the tail of a shaped charge bomb. This ignited the propellant, throwing the explosive toward the target. The weapon possessed a vicious, bone-jarring recoil, and its effective range against moving armour was dangerously close to zero. Aiming its cumbersome iron sights in the pitch blackness was largely a matter of guesswork and desperate prayer. Furthermore, because of the strict weight limits imposed on the glider flights, training ammunition had been severely rationed back in England. Many of the men tasked with holding the line against Hitler's elite panzer divisions had only ever fired inert dummy rounds during their 18 months of preparation. Now, clutching these heavy, unproven steel tubes in the Normandy darkness, they were expected to bottleneck the most feared armoured force in Europe. The wait for that armour did not last long. Shortly after 1 o'clock hours, the tense, breathless silence of the night was broken by a sound that every infantryman dreads: the distinct, metallic squeal of unlubricated tank tracks and the deep, guttural thrum of heavy engines. It was coming from the south, rolling methodically down the dark road leading directly from the town of Bénouville toward the Caen Canal Bridge. The ground began to vibrate subtly beneath the boots of the British defenders lying in their shallow scrapes. In the pitch blackness, they couldn't visually identify the approaching threat, but they could feel its immense, crushing weight pressing against the night air. Howard's men maintained strict, agonizing fire discipline. The Stens and the bolt-action rifles were completely useless against heavy armor. Firing them now would only serve to reveal their carefully concealed positions to the enemy gunners. They had to wait for the shadow to materialize. In the vanguard of the German response was a heavy armoured vehicle probing the road, its commander cautiously navigating the dark, trying to ascertain exactly what had happened to the bridge garrison. As the dark, angular silhouette finally emerged from the tree line, its exhaust spitting dull blue flame, the terrifying reality of the British vulnerability crystallised. If this single vehicle managed to breach the outer perimeter, it could drive directly onto the bridge itself. From that elevated, fortified position, it could systematically dismantle the lightly armed airborne platoons with heavy machine gun and cannon fire, clearing the way for the rest of the division. The entire British defence, and by extension the security of the invasion beaches miles away, suddenly rested on a single Piat team positioned near a T-junction on the approach road. Holding that specific Piat was Sergeant Charles Thornton. Like many of his comrades, Thornton was intimately familiar with the theoretical mechanics of the weapon, but the violent reality of combat is a completely different physics equation. He knew the limitations of the spring-loaded tube in his hands. He knew he had to let the armour get uncomfortably, suicidally close to ensure a guaranteed hit in the dark. The vehicle rumbled forward, its tracks churning the gravel, 50 yards, 40 yards. The rhythmic noise of its engine grew deafening, drowning out the sound of the men's own breathing in the trenches. Thornton remained absolutely motionless in the ditch, his finger resting lightly on the heavy trigger. 30 yards. The armoured vehicle was now so close he could clearly smell the hot oil, the exhaust, and the diesel fumes wafting off its steel hull. He knew with absolute certainty that he would only get one shot. If he missed, if the bomb deflected off angled armour, or if the primitive firing mechanism simply failed to detonate, the bright flash of the propellant would instantly expose his exact position. The vehicle's gunner would swing the turret and cut him in half with high explosive shells before he could ever hope to manually recock the massive spring. At a range of barely 30 yards, Thornton squeezed the trigger. The heavy internal spring snapped forward with a loud metallic clank, driving the steel spigot deeply into the bomb. A split second later, the shaped charge launched from the trough with a violent concussive blast. The heavy projectile flew through the dark and struck the approaching armoured vehicle squarely. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The shape's charge functioned perfectly, punching a jet of superheated metal straight through the armour plate and instantly igniting the onboard ammunition and fuel reserves. A blinding, roaring column of white-hot fire erupted into the night sky, accompanied by a deafening shockwave that threw the nearby defenders to the ground. The vehicle was instantly transformed into a blazing inferno, its stored ammunition cooking off in a series of terrifying secondary explosions that sent jagged shrapnel tearing blindly through the surrounding trees and hedgerows. Thornton's desperate, perfectly timed shot achieved something far more valuable than simply destroying a single piece of enemy armour. The burning wreck stopped dead in the dead centre of the narrow road, instantly creating a massive, impassable wall of fire and twisted steel. For the next several critical hours, no other German mechanised vehicle could push past this blazing roadblock without pushing the wreckage into the ditches, a nearly impossible task under fire. A single, flawless action by a man using a weapon he barely trusted had successfully bottlenecked the immediate German armoured response. But the victory came with a severe tactical cost. The roaring fire also served as a blazing beacon, illuminating the surrounding fields and signalling exactly where the British perimeter was established. The cautious probing was over. The enemy knew exactly where they were, and the real, sustained assault was about to begin. To understand why the 181 men of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry were not immediately crushed by a massive, overwhelming armoured counterstroke in the hours that followed, one must look away from the blazing wreck at the T-junction and peer deep into the architecture of the German command structure. On paper, the German military machine stationed in Normandy was a terrifying, highly efficient apparatus. Positioned just a few miles from the captured bridges were heavy elements of the 21st Panzer Division, a heavily armoured, battle-hardened formation that was theoretically capable of rolling over Howard's lightly armed paratroopers in a matter of 20 minutes. But the German response that night was completely paralysed by a toxic, fatal combination of missing leadership, rigid bureaucracy, and institutional arrogance. When the British gliders silently crashed out of the sky, the immediate local German commanders were caught completely off guard, largely because their superior officers were entirely absent from their posts. The commander of the German 7th Army, the man responsible for the immediate defence of the sector, was away at a map-based wargame exercise in Rennes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary tactical mind entirely responsible for designing and defending the Atlantic Wall, was miles away, driving back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The German High Command had analysed the weather reports, noted the high winds and rough seas, and concluded with absolute certainty that no Allied invasion could possibly occur that week. This absence of high-level leadership created a devastating vacuum exactly at the moment when split-second aggressive decisions were required to save the eastern flank. At the local tactical level, the situation was even more chaotic and frustrating. The commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, Major Hans von Luck, was stationed in a headquarters incredibly close to the bridges. When he heard the low, unmistakable roar of heavy bombers passing overhead and the distinct sound of glider crashes in the distance, his seasoned combat instincts immediately told him that a major, coordinated airborne operation was underway. He knew the geography of his sector intimately. He knew that the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River were critical vulnerabilities that had to be protected at all costs. He immediately ordered his armoured units to warm their engines and prepare to move out for a massive counterattack. But under the rigid, deeply flawed command structure imposed directly by Adolf Hitler, von Luck lacked the actual authority to commit his panzers to battle. The German military had historically pioneered and perfected the concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, a doctrine that explicitly empowered local commanders to act aggressively on their own initiative, without waiting for orders from above. It was the philosophy that had fueled the Blitzkrieg, but by 1944, extreme paranoia and an obsessive demand for absolute central control had infected the Nazi high command. The armoured reserves in Normandy, the only force capable of destroying the invasion on the beaches, were locked under the direct personal control of the Führer. Moving a single panzer division required explicit authorization from Supreme Headquarters, located thousands of miles away in the mountains of Berchtesgaden. As Major von Luck frantically worked the radios and telephones, trying to get permission to launch a decisive armoured strike against the bridges, he was met with an impenetrable bureaucratic wall. The reports flowing upward through the German chain of command were confused, contradictory, and deeply downplayed by skeptical staff officers located safely in the rear. The initial frantic calls from the bridge sentries, cut off mid-sentence as the glidermen overwhelmed them, were dismissed as the exaggerated panic of low-quality rear echelon troops. When definitive reports of paratroopers did finally reach higher headquarters, arrogant staff officers simply assumed it was a small-scale commando raid, a diversionary tactic, or the scattered crew of a downed bomber. Nobody in the German high command wanted to take the responsibility of waking Adolf Hitler to ask for permission to release the Panzer reserves, terrified of his infamous wrath if the reports turned out to be a false alarm. This institutional paralysis became the invisible, impenetrable shield protecting Major Howard's men. The German military apparatus, globally renowned for its ruthless speed and efficiency, was bleeding precious hours, waiting for a telephone call that would not come. The local officers, desperate to recapture the vital crossings before dawn, were forced to act on their own, severely handicapped, stripping away their greatest tactical advantage, their concentrated heavy armour. The direct, bloody consequence of this command chaos was a series of disjointed, piecemeal counterattacks that played perfectly into the hands of the deeply entrenched British defenders. Because the local German commanders could not legally coordinate a massive combined arms assault with heavy tanks and rolling artillery barrages, they were forced to send fragmented units of panzer grenadiers and light vehicles down the narrow roads leading to the bridges. They attacked blindly in the dark, stumbling directly into the meticulously planned defensive arcs that Major Howard had established. The combat quickly devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest in the dark. The British Airborne, utilising their 18 months of obsessive, repetitive training, exercised a terrifying level of fire discipline. They didn't open fire randomly into the dark when they heard movement in the brush. They waited in agonising silence until the advancing German infantry was practically on top of their positions. When the British finally did engage, they concentrated the fire of their Bren guns and Stens into devastating, short, interlocking fields of fire. To the confused German grenadiers pushing blindly through the wet hedgerows, this sudden, overwhelming volume of highly disciplined fire created a fatal illusion. Taking heavy casualties from unseen positions, the local German officers mistakenly calculated that they were facing a massive, heavily entrenched British battalion, perhaps even a full regiment. They had absolutely no idea they were being held off by fewer than 200 men, spread incredibly thin. This fundamental miscalculation of British strength forced the Germans to pull back, regroup, and attempt smaller, cautious flanking manoeuvres, wasting even more of the rapidly vanishing night. But while the German command was bleeding precious time, the British defenders were bleeding irreplaceable resources. As the hours dragged on, the physical and psychological toll on D Company began to compound dangerously. They had survived a violent plane crash, executed a full sprint assault, and had now been fighting continuously in the cold and dark for hours. Their meagre medical supplies were completely exhausted, forcing the medics to use torn strips of captured parachute silk to bandage the mounting number of wounded men lying in the damp trenches. More critically, their ammunition was running terrifyingly low. The Bren gunners were carefully counting their remaining magazines, firing only in 2-round bursts. Riflemen were quietly crawling out of their foxholes in the dark to strip bandoliers from their fallen comrades. Every time the firing momentarily ceased, the silence was somehow worse than the noise, because it meant the enemy was actively regrouping for another, heavier push. The men lay in their shallow dirt scrapes, their faces smeared with camouflage paint and sweat, shivering uncontrollably in the pre-dawn chill. They listened to the ominous sounds echoing from the darkness beyond the perimeter. The harsh grinding of heavy gears, the shouting of German officers frantically trying to organise their lines, the definitive, metallic clanking of tracked vehicles manoeuvring into position through the distant village streets. The illusion of the massive British force could only last so long. As the sky to the east began to turn a pale, bruised grey, the absolute tactical advantage of the night began to evaporate. In the growing light of dawn, the Germans would finally be able to see exactly how thin the British perimeter truly was. They would see the distinct lack of heavy weapons, anti-tank guns and artillery. They would see the exhausted faces of a few dozen airborne troops stretched across hundreds of yards of terrain. And worst of all, the paralysis within the German High Command was finally beginning to fracture. The frantic requests for armoured support were slowly, inevitably, making their way up the chain of command. And the real weight of the 21st Panzer Division was finally being untethered from bureaucratic constraint. Major Howard checked his watch. It was nearing 0600 hours. The radio remained dead, yielding only static. There was no sign of the seaborne invasion force, no sound of the massive Allied artillery that was supposed to relieve them. The 181 men had held the vital choke point for over 6 hours, buying the critical time the Allies so desperately needed to storm the beaches. But looking out at the growing cold light of morning and listening to the multiplying, deafening roar of heavy engines amassing just beyond the tree line, Howard and his men knew the brutal truth. They had miraculously survived the night, but their magazines were almost empty, their PIAT bombs were gone, and the full, terrifying fury of the German war machine was finally awake and looking right at them. But as the sun began to rise over Normandy, casting long shadows across the bullet-scarred steel of the bridges, a critical question emerges. What would have actually happened if Major Howard's men had failed? If glider number 1 had crashed into the canal? If the German sentry had immediately pressed the detonator? Or if the Piat bomb had missed that first probing vehicle? Popular history often suggests that the entire D-Day invasion would have instantly collapsed right there on the beaches. The reality of the strategic situation is far more nuanced, but no less terrifying. The loss of the Caen Canal and Orne River crossings would not have automatically doomed Operation Overlord to total failure. The sheer mass of the Allied armada and the overwhelming air superiority they held meant that the seaborne landings would still have progressed. However, the failure to secure this specific choke point would have triggered a highly dangerous cascading chain reaction across the entire eastern flank. If the bridges remained in German hands or were destroyed, the Allied invasion force pushing off Sword Beach would have slammed into a geographical wall. Instead of a rapid, fluid advance inland, the British forces would have been forced to halt, bring up heavy engineering equipment, and fight a brutal, grinding battle to force a crossing over two separate waterways under intense enemy fire. They would have been forced to spend precious, irreplaceable hours fighting through a narrow bottleneck. And time was the exact currency the German military desperately needed to function. That delay would have provided the 21st Panzer Division and the other armoured units waking up in the surrounding countryside the exact window they needed to organise, bypass the bureaucratic paralysis, and reach the beaches in force. Simultaneously, the rest of the British 6th Airborne Division, dropping further east, would have been completely isolated behind enemy lines, cut off from any hope of rapid reinforcement or supply, facing systematic annihilation by mechanised infantry. The true vital value of the glider assault wasn't just the physical capture of steel and concrete, it was the absolute total denial of momentum to an enemy that was structurally paralysed. By holding the line, those 181 men forced the German command to bleed time they did not have, creating a rigid buffer that shielded the chaotic, vulnerable early hours of the beach landings. But this strategic necessity was exacting a brutal physical toll on the men holding that buffer. And as the morning light revealed their painfully thin defences, the breaking point was fast approaching. By mid-morning on June 6th, the situation for D Company had degraded from desperate to critical. They had been fighting continuously for nearly 10 hours, without a single moment of respite, and the psychological weight of their isolation was beginning to crush them. The physical toll of the violent glider crash, the explosive initial sprint, and the relentless night combat had pushed human endurance to its absolute frayed limit. Men were falling asleep in the middle of active firefights, their bodies simply shutting down behind their weapons, only to be violently jerked awake by the deafening crack of mortar shells impacting along the riverbanks. Their most pressing crisis, however, was purely mathematical. The ammunition was practically gone. It was no longer a matter of rationing short bursts from the Bren guns. Infantrymen were down to their last individual clips. Men were frantically scavenging the muddy trenches, patting down their wounded comrades for a handful of .303 caliber rounds. Others had dropped their Lee-Enfield rifles entirely, picking up captured German Mausers and MP-40 submachine guns, desperately holding off the enemy using their own discarded weapons. German snipers had successfully infiltrated the upper floors of the stone houses in the nearby village of Benneville, raining precise, deadly fire down onto the exposed bridge approaches. Major Howard's perimeter was rapidly shrinking, contracting inward toward the steel girders as the German infantry pressed closer, sensing the British weakness in the harsh light of day. The men knew the armoured reserves were finally mobilising. If a concerted mechanised push came down the road now, there was absolutely nothing left in the infantry to stop it. They had reached the undeniable breaking point. And then, just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a bizarre, completely incongruous noise drifted across the smoke-choked French countryside. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the high-pitched whine of a damaged aircraft engine or the distant squeal of unlubricated tank tracks. But as the coastal wind shifted, the sound cut clearly through the rhythmic hammering of machine gun fire. It was the unmistakable, surreal drone of Scottish bagpipes. To the exhausted, ammunition-starved defenders lying in the dirt, it sounded like an auditory hallucination brought on by sheer battle fatigue. But the wailing melody steadily grew louder, more distinct, echoing defiantly across the Normandy lowlands. Marching down the road from the direction of Sword Beach, seemingly oblivious to the mortar shells tearing up the earth around them, were the lead elements of Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade. They were not crawling or diving for cover, they were advancing in a steady, confident column, wearing their distinctive green berets instead of heavy steel helmets, led by a piper blowing fiercely into his instrument under active enemy fire. The commandos had fought their way inland from the landing beaches for miles, battling through German coastal strongpoints to reach the eastern flank. As Lovett crossed a perimeter line, he famously apologised to Major Howard for being exactly 2.5 minutes late. The commandos immediately fanned out, their fresh weapons and heavy volume of fire pushing the encroaching German infantry back into the tree line. As the Green Berets poured across the steel spans, relieving the battered airborne troops, the immense, suffocating pressure of the last 10 hours finally shattered. Howard's men slumped into their shallow dirt scrapes, their hands shaking as the adrenaline abruptly drained from their systems. The vital crossings were finally, definitively secure. The immediate crisis of survival was over. But as the fresh troops surged past them toward the front lines, the exhausted glidermen, looking back at the bullet-pocked steel, slowly began to realize what they had actually achieved in the darkness. In the cold, clear light of that June morning, the true physical reality of what had just transpired finally became visible. Scattered across the small field immediately adjacent to the Caen Canal, the shattered, splintered remains of the wooden Horsa gliders lay completely exposed. Looking at those fragile, canvas-wrapped boxes, violently crushed into the mud just paces from the steel girders they were sent to capture, the sheer audacity of those midnight minutes becomes almost impossible to fully comprehend. When history looks back at the invasion of Normandy, the collective memory is almost entirely consumed by the staggering, industrial scale of the operation. We picture the horizon completely choked with thousands of grey warships. We hear the relentless thunder of heavy naval artillery bombarding the coastline, and we focus on the chaotic, massive struggles of tens of thousands of men storming the fortified sands of the invasion beaches. It is universally remembered as a triumph of overwhelming brute force logistics and unlimited firepower. But the eastern anchor of that colossal endeavour was not secured by a massive armada, nor was it taken by an overwhelming artillery barrage. It was locked down by a surgical strike in the pitch blackness, hours before the first landing craft ever dropped its ramp into the surf. This small-scale action fundamentally altered the geometry of the battlefield. A deeply isolated vanguard of lightly armed infantrymen successfully eliminated a massive operational threat before the rigid German command structure could even process that they were actually under attack. They did not achieve this by fielding heavier weapons or relying on overwhelming numbers. They achieved it because of 18 months of agonizing, obsessive repetition back in England. The men of D Company proved that fanatical rehearsal, flawless midnight execution, and raw human endurance could completely paralyze a numerically superior, heavily armored force. They stripped the German military machine of its most vital tactical resource, time. The stark contrast between those few splintered gliders resting quietly in the Normandy grass and the sprawling, violent armada storming the coastline miles away defines the true legacy of that night. The fate of the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted did not just hinge on the weight of the armour hitting the sand. It depended entirely on a few dozen men refusing to surrender a narrow strip of asphalt in the dark. Long before the immense armada of Operation Overlord ever breached the horizon, the trajectory of the most famous day in military history had already been violently altered in the freezing air over a dark French canal. The ultimate outcome of the invasion began to be decided hours before dawn, when a deeply isolated force, acting entirely without the support of heavy tanks or artillery, crashed out of the night sky. In a vanishingly small window of just 10 frantic minutes, exactly 181 lightly armed men executed an assault so relentless that it accomplished something the German High Command could not even imagine, making the impossible a reality and permanently closing the door to the Normandy beaches before the sun ever rose.